Hey, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our next Computer Side Chat, where we're going to start to wrap up the amendments and wrap up this unit. So it's been a very long look at the Constitution, and it's culminated in this look at all 27 amendments, where we've looked at the Bill of Rights, and then we've looked at Amendments 11 through 27 by grouping them together rather than looking at them in order. So we're going to finish that process today by looking at the Progressive Era amendments and looking at the Unique Circumstance amendments. So let's go ahead and jump into that now. All right, so like I just said, we're going to be looking at the Progressive Era and Unique Circumstance amendments. And our essential question is not that much different from the essential question for our last set of notes. What are two examples of ways that the Progressive Amendments and the Unique Circumstance Amendments allow for the Constitution to better accomplish the goals laid out in the preamble? So once again, you may have to use those notes on the preamble as a refresher so that you can properly answer this question. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So let's start with the Progressive Era amendments. And so first off, what are they? Well, Progressive Era amendments are amendments passed during the 1910s and 1920s, during what we know as the Progressive Era. And this is when a lot of changes were made to government so that it could both better represent society as well as better provide for people within society. These changes were largely led by the three progressive presidents that in order were Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So let's look at the individual amendments themselves. So first off is the 16th Amendment. And the 16th Amendment gives Congress the ability to levy income tax. In other words, Congress has the ability to tax the income of citizens. Now, it's worth reminding you that amendments cannot pass unless they have wide-range support across the country. So it might seem kind of odd that there's an amendment where it received a lot of support for essentially taxing the people, that people were welcoming the government to tax them. And the reason for that has to do with how before this government got most of its revenue. Before the 16th Amendment, the majority of government revenue came from tariffs, which are taxes on imported and exported goods. And the problem with tariffs is that they can be changed often. And so how much a tariff is on a certain good can change relatively quickly. A tariff placed on one good can affect the price of another good. And so the problem with basing things on tariffs is that it creates very unstable prices. And so the price of goods fluctuated quite rapidly and consistently. By passing the 16th Amendment, it made it so that government could rely on that for the majority of their revenue, thus leaving tariffs largely stabilized and unchanged, and thus stabilizing prices. So in the long run, citizens actually saved money because of this amendment. And so that's how it got passed. Excuse me. 17th Amendment says that U.S. senators will be directly elected rather than chosen by state legislatures. So we've talked about how Congress is structured, that you have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. It used to be that we would only vote for members of the House. The Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures or the state lawmaking bodies. And the reason for that was that half of the legislative body then would be above the influence of the voter, because the framers weren't just worried about the tyranny of a single individual becoming a king-like figure. They were also worried about the tyranny that could come with democracy. And so they wanted the Senate to act as a check on the voters. The problem with this is it was ripe for corruption. In other words, it became a pay-to-play scheme. If you were a wealthy donor you could donate to key members of a state's legislature and get yourself chosen to be in the Senate, even if you were completely unqualified. So it created this very corrupt spoil system where individuals were being put in the Senate because of their wealth and influence rather than their ability to actually do the job. And so the 17th Amendment takes that power away from state governments and gives it to the people themselves and allowed them to choose their senators rather than depending on elected state-level representatives to do that for them. Next is the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is what brought about prohibition. In other words, all alcohol is banned because of the 18th Amendment. This was an unmitigated disaster. More on that a little bit later. 19th Amendment. We've already talked about this one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because this also overlaps with the suffrage amendments. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. All right, next, unique circumstance amendments. So these are our last three amendments of the 27. And very simply, these amendments are ones that we can't really pair up with any other amendments. They are largely unique. The circumstances that led to their passage or what they do is not similar to any of the other amendments, hence the title here. So with each of these, not only will we define them, but we'll also talk about why those amendments are unique. All right, first off is the 11th Amendment. And the 11th Amendment basically says that citizens cannot sue a state in federal court. So in other words, a citizen cannot sue the state of Ohio or the state of Illinois, the state of California. It gives certain levels of immunity to state-level governments. Now, it's important to understand that this is not universal. In other words, you can still sue a state over certain things. This really largely ties into, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. Most prominently, that ties into violations of, say, the Bill of Rights is an exception to this rule. In which citizens can sue the government for violating their constitutional rights, or excuse me, sue state-level governments for violating their constitutional rights. Other than that, though, this gives states immunity from frivolous lawsuits that could be launched against them by citizens as an attempt to just grab money. So it's unique because it is the only amendment that changes federal jurisdiction. Specifically, it reduces federal jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction is something we'll get into more down the road, but essentially it means the cases that the federal courts can hear. So this amendment reduces federal jurisdiction. It reduces the type of cases that can be heard by federal courts. Next, we have the 21st Amendment. So I talked about the 18th already. The 18th outlawed alcohol and banned alcohol. And like I said, that was an unmitigated disaster for many reasons. The 18th came about because of something called the temperance movement, which basically talked about alcoholism and alcohol being a root cause of issues within society itself. Not just alcoholism, but other various immoral activities. The passage of the 18th led to a lot of other issues that were not foreseen, most notably organized crime. So the mafia got a big foothold in the U.S. because of the 18th Amendment, selling liquor illegally. But probably the most tragic outcome of the 18th Amendment is bootleggers, especially in the South, would often race to deliver their product, and we consider that to be the roots of NASCAR racing. So you can thank watching people turn left for 4 hours on the 18th Amendment. The 21st Amendment repeals the 18th because of how much of a disaster it was and how many problems it ended up creating. This amendment is unique because it is the only amendment that has been passed to repeal another. In other words, The 18th Amendment is null and void because of the 21st, and that's the only amendment that we can say that is the case with. No other amendment has been overturned by a amendment being passed later down the road. So that's what makes this one unique. And then lastly, we have the 27th Amendment. And the 27th Amendment says that Congress cannot give itself a raise, at least not immediately. In other words, if Congress, who controls money, wants to give members of Congress a raise, they can do that, but that raise will not take effect until after the next election. So if you are a member of the House and you vote in favor to give your position a raise, you will have to win your next election before you can see that increase in money. If you lose your next election, you will never see that increase. That raise will go to whoever it is that beats you in that election. This amendment was unique because it took over 200 years to pass. This amendment was actually included in the original package of amendments that were proposed for the Bill of Rights. So there were more than 10 amendments initially proposed. This was one of them. The only ones that passed were the 10 that we have talked about. And so this amendment sat proposed but unratified for 200 years until, I believe, the 1990s. Early 1990s is when this amendment was finally ratified and added to the Constitution. So that's why this thing is unique, is because it was proposed but not ratified until 200 years after its proposal. All right, that is all of the amendments. We have gone through all 27 of them. So now is going to be a lot of hitting on these amendments and just making sure we know them and understand them before our test. Part of that is actually going to be where you are going to have to come up with your own 28th Amendment. In other words, what do you think is missing? What do you think needs to be added to the Constitution that is not covered by what we've gone over or by the amendments that have been added since the ratification of the Constitution itself? So go ahead, answer the essential question in your summary section, and I will see you guys tomorrow.